Okay, so this is for the Unit 1 modified test. I'm going over the most missed questions. This particular test seemed to have several more questions that were what I would say most missed, but I'm still going to go over them. That way you can kind of have an idea on what you did wrong. Hopefully this will help those of you that have the opportunity to improve your grade. If you made less than a 60, I will give you a specific assignment that will allow you to add up to 10 points to your grade. Those of you that were between 60 and 70, you should have been okay. We consider that the passing standard is 60 and above. So while that may technically be, failing as far as having a D, as far as our data is concerned, 60 or above is at least meeting the standard. So this should help all of you, even the ones that have met the standards or even maybe got an 80 or 90 on the test. If you're really wanting to know perhaps what question you missed, this will help you do this without having to use class time. So the first question that was the most missed is question 10, that talks about how did the growth of industry affect American society. This is specific to the Gilded Age, and it's really kind of an era characteristic question. The answer to this is going to be that the percentage of Americans living in urban areas increased. Remember, one of our key vocabulary words is urbanization. And people were moving there, whether it's immigrants moving into the cities or people from the rural areas leaving the farm. Remember, a lot of farms were going bankrupt, and so those people would go into the city to find work. So that is a key kind of characteristic question that you need to know. Also, question 11. This one had you read a table, which generally those should be pretty simple. It's showing population distributions from 1870 to 1910. And then it says, which statement best explains the population trend? Well, if you look at the population trend, you can see that the rural population keeps increasing. And so we've got that happening. You're also going to see that the rural population is increasing as well. So it's either going to be a question talking about the increase of population overall, or it's going to be specific to the increase of the urban population. And so what we see is that the answer choices here, the correct answer is going to be there was a high demand for workers to fill factory jobs in the late 1800s and early 1900s. The truth is, you probably didn't even have to read that chart to know that. But if you look at the sheer numbers of population, we know that the population of the United States increased rapidly during the Gilded Age. And the question is why? Well, it's because there was industrialization created jobs. We can't question the answer choice A. When you're talking about immigrants becoming farmers, you should know that's just not true. When we talked about immigration, we talked about how immigrants were coming in as unskilled workers, not to become farmers. And obviously, this chart doesn't talk about the difference between men and women, and it's showing increasing population numbers. So I think that perhaps maybe you either didn't read the question all the way through, or you got kind of thrown off by the increase in the number of immigrants, and then you didn't read the rest of that question. So be sure when you're taking a test that you're reading all of the question and all of the answer choices. It's very important for you to do because sometimes it's the end of the answer choice that really helps you figure out what the answer is going to be. The next one is question 15. We talked about this one specifically when we talked about segregation. We talked about Jim Crow laws. I showed you the cartoon of the minstrel show. And we talked about Plessy v. Ferguson. And that Jim Crow laws were meant to keep former slaves from participating in politics. Remember, and I kind of made this connection, that the populists had allowed blacks to join them. And people in the South, especially the Southern Democrats, did not want blacks voting. They didn't want the populists taking over, and they didn't want to change their kind of Civil War system. And so that's what we see happening with Jim Crow laws. We talked about the poll taxes and the literacy test and all those kinds of things. So we did mention this. I actually mentioned it a couple of different times. The next most missed one is number 17. That's a question about Andrew Carnegie and how did he reject social Darwinism. You had to know what social Darwinism was, and you had to know what Andrew Carnegie believed. Of course, social Darwinism is the survival of the fittest, it's the survival of the strong, that those individuals that were successful because they were just a little bit better than everyone else. And I was concerned about social Darwinism because you guys' group is the first group that didn't already have an understanding of the basics of Darwinism from biology. So I was a little bit concerned about how you would connect that with social Darwinism. And so remember, social Darwinism would say that the wealthy deserve to be special, that they deserve to be separated. So obviously that answer is not going to be A. Because Andrew Carnegie rejects that idea. So he would reject that and turn away from that. And Andrew Carnegie does not believe that the government should be involved. Andrew Carnegie was a captain of industry, so he liked business and he believed in supporting business. What he said was the gospel of wealth, that people that benefited from the system needed to turn around and give back to society. And they would do so through the concept of philanthropy. So we talked about these vocabulary terms. If you had looked on the Gilded Age Quizlet, it should have been there. And so that's how you could have reasoned that out. I mean, you should know that Andrew Carnegie, as a captain of industry, wouldn't care about regulating trade or providing aid. And you would also see that this concept of separating the separated by wealth is not going to fly with him either, because he believes people should give back. The next most missed question is question number 18. This is one that was missed by people in the other two groups, and I can tell you exactly why, because a lot of you did not bother to watch the Politics in the Gilded Age video that I sent you. I told you that that was going to be on the test, and that's why I tied the that extra credit quiz to it, so that way you would have a reason. Not only was it required as like an assignment, but it was also incentivized because you had a chance to earn extra credit. But I don't think very many of you did that, because number 18, the Interstate Commerce Act and the populist movement, even if you hadn't watched that video, you should have understood that the populist movement comes out of the fact that industrialization was hurting farmers, that the tariff protections were contributing to lowering farm prices, that the railroad rates were hurting farmers and making it more expensive for them to transport their goods. And so these are all abuses of industrialization. So even if you hadn't watched the video, you should have connected the populist movement. But certainly if you had watched the video, you would have known that the Interstate Commerce Act regulates railroad rates. It guarantees that railroad rates are fair to everybody regardless of how much you're transporting. And so it wouldn't, of course, we haven't even talked about imperialism yet. And of course, the populist movement doesn't talk about unrestricted immigration anyways. So that was question number 18. The next one, question 20, this was a 4-answer choice one. I had a few of these for you guys on questions that I felt were pretty simple. And obviously I was wrong on this one. During the early 1800s, which factor contributed the most to the start of the Industrial Revolution in the United States? That answer choice should have been the abundance of natural resources. I think that some of you might have connected electricity with that, or even connected it to the end of the slavery system. But remember that the key words on this question: contributed the most to the start of the Industrial Revolution. Most and start are your key words here. What was the start of the Industrial Revolution? Where did we kick off this unit? We kicked off this unit talking about the natural resources, right? The whole reason why we kind of went back and kind of looked at Reconstruction was to help explain why people were leaving the South, why they were, going to Texas to look for opportunities, why they were willing to take advantage of the Homestead Act, why they were willing to go and try mining. That's what this whole system was. And we talked about bringing the natural resources from the west to the east so the factories could make the products. And so the correct answer choice here was the abundance of natural resources. The availability of electricity happens farther down the line in industrialization. So you're talking 1880s, 1890s. And remember, this is going to be in the 1800s. This is going to be before that. And the end of the slave labor system happens, that isn't necessarily a contributing factor to the Industrial Revolution, except, of course, that the slavery issue is no longer around. So I think you might have overthought on that question. That could be a little bit tricky. So 23 is the next one. This is another 4-answer choice one. The emergence of populism is often tied to which of the following late 19th century issues? It's high agricultural stress. Populism is tied to farmers. So farmers are involved in agriculture. So that's what you should be looking at. And they wanted more money in circulation. So it can't be D. They want government regulation of railroad, and it's because you've got farmers that are really, really hurting financially. So high agricultural stress, and we talked about populists quite a bit, so you should have recognized that answer. The next one is number 24. This one we mentioned kind of briefly, and I kind of threw that in there, so I guess I can see why you might have missed it, because it wasn't a point that I really hammered home, but you should have maybe kind of just logically thought about it. Which of the following helped bring an end to the cattle drives? Barbed wire, right? They put barbed wire up and it kept them from being able to run the cattle all the way up from Texas. You should know that gold mining wouldn't have anything to do with the cattle drives. It wouldn't have had an effect. The Dawes Severalty Act, that's the one that breaks up the Indian reservations, so you should have recognized that. And we haven't even talked about the National Reclamation Act. And so even if you couldn't reason out that, okay, what would stop them from driving cows? Well, it would be barbed wire. Even if you didn't remember me mentioning it, and I'll give you that I mentioned it briefly. So even if you didn't remember that, you should have at least been able to eliminate most of the other answers. And so so that was one of the ones you missed a lot of. The next one's 26. Why were immigrants motivated to migrate to the United States? It's the American dream, right? That's why people come to the United States. Obviously not to live in a warmer climate. Seek out new technologies and cheaper goods. Those are not reasons why people move and change countries. Changing countries and immigrating is a huge undertaking. This is a big commitment. People aren't going to do this because, I just want to have more technology, or, I want to have cheaper goods. They wanted to pursue the American dream, the freedom from oppression and that kind of thing. And we talked about the pull factors. In fact, I intentionally did not spend a lot of time talking about push factors because I wanted you to be able to kind of connect with what was pulling people into the United States. So that's number 26. The next one, 27, is another one. This one got a lot of people confused too on the other versions of the test. The issue of unemployment and declining wages on the West Coast led to which of the legislative actions? I could see kind of maybe why you were a little bit confused, except you should recognize the Dawes Act as being the same thing as the Dawes Severalty Act. So you should have recognized that one, and that was definitely on the Indian PowerPoint that I went over at the very beginning, that talked about breaking up the reservations into homesteads and ranches, right? And so people, you should have known that wasn't correct, that had nothing to do with unemployment. The Homestead Act doesn't have anything to do with unemployment because it has to do with giving people farmland in the Great Plains. And so that would have only left C, the Chinese Exclusion Act. You could have also approached it from thinking, and this is a more complicated way to think of it, but if you had thought, okay, what were one of the concerns about declining wages and unemployment? Well, that's related to immigrants, right? Well, immigrants on the West Coast, well, that would have been the Chinese. So you could have reasoned it out either way. But you should have recognized this because I mentioned the Chinese Exclusion Act multiple times. The next one is going to be question 28. One result of the passage of the Homestead